Welcome to another episode of Savor Food and Body. Today I'm talking with Dr. Caitlin. She is a naturopathic doctor and she cares for women and children primarily. She pairs a philosophy of patient-centered, whole-body, individualized care with an emphasis on nutrition, botanical medicine, and a balanced approach to joyful living. For women, she is focused on gut health, hormone balance, optimal mood, and energy with a specialty in enhancing preconception health, fertility, supporting healthy pregnancy, and balance postpartum. Most recently, she has embraced spreading the word about perimenopause in her new podcast mini-series. It's still to be determined if she's going to do a second season. The podcast is called The Change, and it's about perimenopause for people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. She also enjoys providing safe, effective options for children's health and wellness, especially optimizing gut health, immunity, and nutrition. And one of the reasons I wanted to have Dr. Caitlin on when I was introduced to her work is not only her new interest in perimenopause and some of the wisdom that she can share with us and our audience today, but also just this approach of health at every size in the naturopathic space, in health balancing, weight neutral approach to health and wellness, which is kind of a rarity in the naturopathic world. So Dr. Caitlin, thank you so much for being here and spending the time with us today. And I'm so excited for our conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to chat.
So let's just jump right into some of the perimenopause stuff. I'd love to start there. And why, let's talk about the weight gain piece of things. And I think in doing this, we might get a sense too of your philosophy with health at every size in terms of body changes in midlife. So first of all, let's go through the nuts and bolts of, first of all, why women in midlife are gaining weight and the changes in body shape as they age, why those are happening, and why that isn't necessarily a bad thing, which is a huge myth buster in itself.
Yes, yeah, because I would say a majority of folks who come to me during perimenopause, one of the things that they're concerned with is weight changes, body shape changes. And if you look at the way sort of healthcare is marketed to women and people in perimenopause, a lot of it is around modifying weight, modifying shape. And I think, it's multifaceted. Why do people's bodies tend to change in midlife? One of the things that we see is perimenopause is, a transition from reproductive hormones, which are a little bit more for people with typical ovulatory cycles. They're having regular ovulatory cycles with a regular production of estrogen to progesterone. As people are transitioning through perimenopause to menopause, we see those estrogen levels at some points during perimenopause trending higher, but generally trending lower over time to sort of a low, steady postmenopausal state with sort of lower progesterone levels. So when estrogen levels change, we can see a tendency towards weight gain. We can also see a tendency towards people holding a little bit more weight in their midsection. And it's essentially a different way of sort of distributing fat, which is sort of super normal, non-pathological. The other thing that we can see during perimenopause is a trend towards insulin resistance. And this is a tricky one because insulin resistance, independent of weight, that's sort of a thing that I think we need to separate, because you can have people at all body shapes and sizes experiencing insulin resistance. But insulin resistance, which is where your body is needing higher than optimal insulin levels to keep your blood sugar balanced, insulin resistance becomes more common with these hormonal shifts. And when people are more insulin resistant, they tend to hold on to weight a little bit more. And of all the things we're talking about, insulin resistance does have some health implications that are, again, completely unrelated to weight, but it's, we're so obsessed with weight being the only marker for health. It's hard for people to pull those things apart. We also see an increased sensitivity to stress and cortisol levels in this phase of life. So as we have less estrogen, which kind of helps our brain buffer stressors a little bit, we are more sensitive to cortisol, when cortisols are a little bit higher, when cortisol is a little bit higher, we can see that leading to sort of weight gain against, especially some of that like abdominal distribution. So all of those things are sort of pretty typical and not necessarily, the body shape changes associated with lower estrogen, super normal, non-pathological, nothing needs to sort of be done about it. The cortisol and insulin resistance piece, those can have sort of some health implications that are independent of body shape and size, right? So that's the hard part, is that we can treat those things and optimize people's health outcomes, but that might not change their body shape and size because that's sort of not the pathological component of it, right? The thing that's so hard in diet culture and the way that we think about sort of weight as being like the only biomarker that matters is you have people in smaller bodies who aren't being treated for things like insulin resistance because if they're not sort of gaining weight or having changes in body shape, they think, oh, that means I'm perfectly healthy. So we're missing some people who are at higher risk for cardiovascular disease and other concerns. And then you have people in larger bodies who, instead of being treated for insulin resistance, they're just said, okay, go on a diet, which isn't necessarily going to treat that anyway. So there's a lot of factors sort of going into it, but the biggest one being that decrease in estrogen, which changes body fat distribution in a way that isn't harmful and might actually be potentially helpful as well.
I'm so glad that you brought in that insulin resistance piece of things, because the number of women that I work with, and they're coming because maybe they've seen those biomarkers change with indicating more insulin resistance, blood sugar is going up. And they're also seeing this body weight change, weight distribution, fat distribution change. And because of the popular culture, and maybe even because of some of the care, the medical care that they've gotten prior, it marries those two things together. And so they're like, okay, great, I'm going to go to the dietitian. She's going to help me lose weight. And then that'll also help my blood sugar issues or my insulin resistant issues. And I love how you're pulling those things apart, because they're not exclusive.
Yeah. And then the other thing that's hard about that is people can do all of these things that are great for balancing their blood sugar. They can increase their movement. They can build their muscle mass. They can decrease like blood sugar spikes. But if it doesn't result in weight loss, then they're like, well, that didn't work. That didn't work. I'm not going to do that anymore. Even though we've improved all these other health markers, when we only look at weight as our measure of, is a program working, yes or no, people will throw away all of these really generally healthy, helpful lifestyle choices because they're not resulting in weight loss. So it's really damaging to our overall conception of health when we're so laser focused on, okay, it's just this marker. This is the only marker that I'm going to pay attention to. Because I'm sure you've had that experience where somebody comes back, we've implemented X, Y, and Z, and they're like, oh yeah, my sleep is better, my mood is better, I'm feeling more energized, but I didn't lose weight, or I gained a little bit of weight, therefore I stopped doing everything.
Yes.
Like,
yes.
Are you listening to this?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Or I spend a lot of time sitting with women in that really frustrated space because they think, okay, I'm doing something proactively to support my health by going to this professional.
Yeah.
She's helping me with my food. And even if they can check off some of those boxes, like you said, like sleep is improved, mood is more stable, stress management is better, especially in this midlife space. But if they're still so hung up on that number, they're still going to feel like a failure because they've been taught to feel like a failure because that number hasn't changed.
Yeah.
And that's what diet culture teaches us. And so there's a lot of reframing and a lot of like brain rewiring that has to be done. And around that sense of, we are really working towards improving your health, and we have to rewrite that script that weight is the main indicator of your health. Like, we're looking at your other biomarkers. We're looking at your insulin. We're looking at your blood sugar. Like, we are being mindful of all of that stuff. And your weight may or may not change, go up, down. We don't know. That is independent of all these things. So please don't throw in the towel on all of these behaviors that you're making because you're not seeing your clothes fit differently or what have you.
Yeah. And it's tricky. And I empathize with people so much. It is one of those areas of my practice and conversation where I understand why people are frustrated, because it's the messages, it's the programming, everything we're taught is that, having a lower number on the scale means that you're healthier. Looking a certain way means that you're healthier. Aging is bad and terrible, and your body changes in ways that you should try to fight all the time. So I'm not surprised that I'm having these conversations with people. It's in our conversation, I'm constantly working to reprogram my own stories and challenge things, because it is kind of constant. You're like a little fish swimming upstream trying to kind of push up against all of these messages. So it's an understandable frustration that people have, and just a conversation again I'm constantly having over and over. But yeah, that reprogramming piece is so important, because then not only do you have folks discounting habits that might be healthy for their health, but then they're also getting these stressful, toxic messages, which isn't great for their health either. So it's a double-edged sword. Not only are we less likely to engage in those behaviors that are healthful but might not result in weight loss, but also when they're not resulting in weight loss, we're increasing our negative self-talk and our judgment and our, fear and loathing around food in our bodies, which is going to make everything worse on top of it. So it's, one of the biggest works in my practice, and I'm sure in your practice as well, is doing our best to help people sort of walk through that process and getting to a place, not necessarily on the other side, but slightly farther into that less of a diet culture world, or at least being able to have a critical analysis. Not that we never have those, thoughts and scripts come back, but we're able to meet them with some critical analysis. Wait a second, is that true? Why do I think that way? What's another possible path? Because I think that's one of the most harmful narratives when it comes to people's health across the board, but specifically women's health, is counteracting some of those sort of negative messages that we get from everywhere. We get it from our families, we get it from the media, but we also get it from healthcare, and we certainly get it from the holistic and naturopathic healthcare world, not universally, but I think because it's so embedded into our culture, a lot of folks use that as their sort of marketing tools, even if they're packaging it as, wellness or cleanse or, whatever way you want to dress it up. The driving factor is often, hey, let's change the size and shape of your body. Let's get weight loss in some way. So it makes sense that folks have this struggle. But I do think it's important, at least for me, and I'm guessing for you and the people that listen to your podcast as well, to sort of look at that with a critical eye and try to maneuver out of some of the negative impacts of that.
Well, one of the things I want to highlight that you said earlier in regards to that estrogen decline and which this was new information to me. I didn't realize that estrogen was also helpful in helping us mitigate the increased stress in midlife. And so to your point, what you were just saying too, is that if we are so stressed about what that number on the scale says, the number of the pants size, say, or needing to buy a higher size of pants, and yet we're in this space of life where we're not tolerating stress as well, and that is then increasing the cortisol. And so I just wanted to highlight that that pairing that's happening, this perfect storm that's happening in midlife, to where biochemically with estrogen declining, you're going to be less likely to cope. So this is a perfect time to try to do that rewiring of your brain and not be so hung up on that weight number, because in reality, it might only increase your stress even more, which you don't have the same coping tools that you used to all this time.
Yeah, you're just pouring some fuel on the fire. And the other thing that can be helpful it's common, and, everybody's a little different, but it's pretty common for folks throughout that perimenopausal transition to gain somewhere between like 5 and 20 pounds, sort of based on the research. But what's interesting is our fat tissue is an endocrine organ, and some of that fat distribution can produce more baseline estrogen levels, right? Like once our ovaries go to retirement, they're not, making cyclic estrogen. They make a little bit of low background estrogen, but we can actually make a little bit of estrogen from that fat tissue as well. So there's some data that suggests that increased weight loss is actually protective. It can be protective for bone. It can be protective against hot flashes, that it's not necessarily like a bug, but like a feature of the system that, it might be helpful going into this phase of life with a little bit of extra adipose tissue that has some hormonal component to it as well. So instead of something to fight against, it's just sort of like, oh, hey, look at this great pre-programmed thing my body is doing. I've got a little bit of buffer against some of those declining estrogen levels that are kind of coming from the ovaries that some of my other body systems can take over for. So it's not necessarily, a default or a defect as much as it might be something that potentially had evolutionary benefit as well.
Right. I've heard women describe it as, we were always taught of it as the spare tire, a negative connotation to it, but to reframe that and think of it as the life preserver because of those protective benefits. Yeah. Which then speaks to the point where during this time, it would not be beneficial to trying to be focused on intentional weight loss, because then you could, it's my understanding, you correct me if I'm wrong, but you could potentially increase the symptoms of perimenopause because you're kind of fighting against your body trying to make a little behind the scenes estrogen with that increased adipose tissue. Yeah. And so could we see more moodiness, more increased hot flashes, less quality sleep, things like that, which when I phrase it that way to some women, they're like, oh, hell no, I do not want more hot flashes. Like,
mm-hmm. And that's not even taking into account that we know when people are undergoing caloric restriction and different types of diets, that's going to worsen sleep. That's going to worsen. It's like, it's like all of the sort of negative impacts that dieting can have on your health, independent of hormonal changes. When you're layering that on top of hormonal changes, you're not doing yourself any favors.
So I'm curious then, as you're talking to patients, and you've talked about this a little bit already, but I'm curious to hear your spiel around like how you talk to patients about weight, especially women in perimenopause. Like, do you come in with this, hey, it's protective stance, or how do you have those conversations with women?
It's hard. And like I said, I haven't figured out that, persuasive argument that gets everybody on board. I would say there's certainly patients that are sort of frustrated with me, that maybe don't continue to see me as a healthcare provider because I don't, as a rule, prescribe things or work with people with their number one health outcome sort of being weight loss. And I even have people that say, oh, I saw in your, intake paperwork that you are a health at every size. And I listened to your podcast and I know you don't do dieting, but I'm here for weight loss. And I'm like, you guys, go on. And I work with everybody. I'm so happy. So all that to say is I try to meet people sort of where they are first and foremost, and then come with that compassion of understanding why so many folks are thinking that sort of weight is a number one sort of priority for their health, for their happiness, their well-being. That's all very understandable. What I try to explain to folks, my whole spiel is, my goal as a doctor is to help you sort of improve your health on the spectrum of what's sort of available to you based on your genetics and circumstances and all that. That doesn't look the same for everyone. And that by focusing on weight, we are missing important things. We are missing more important things. And that one of the tenets of naturopathic medicine is to trust that the body does have some inherent wisdom to it and a process to it. And so what I want to do is work with folks to optimize their health and then trust their body will find that metabolic place that is perfect for them. And that's going to look different. Everybody's bodies are going to look different in a state of metabolic health, right? We have this idea that health, again, looks like this one thing, but we know health exists along a whole spectrum of body sizes. The other thing that I point out is I'll often talk about how fat tissue can be protective, that when it comes to bone health and brain health, being slightly overweight is or overweight, that's a weird way to say it. Because what's over, what's under, normal. I'm doing normal in quote unquotes. That's my least favorite thing is when people talk about, a normal weight. Mm-hmm. But folks that go into perimenopause and menopause and just aging in general with a higher body fat percentage actually tend to do better. They are less frail. They're less likely to suffer fractures. They're likely to recover from illness sort of with more frequency. So I try to sort of offer some facts around that. And then I always offer so much empathy of like, I get it. I understand how hard it is to be an aging person, specifically an aging sort of woman in our culture, that all of the messages you get around it are like, this is bad. You're not going to be sexually desirable. Your body's going to change. How embarrassing. You should cover it up. All of these things. And I'm like, empathizing and then saying like, how can we reframe it? How do we take like small steps? The good thing, what I do like about folks in perimenopause is oftentimes they're getting to the point where they're realizing, so many of the things I've sort of been taught, so many of these societal sort of norms aren't serving me anymore. And I'm like ready to let them go. So I do think it's an interesting phase of life where folks might be a little bit more open to being like, yeah, you know what, like, screw it. Like I am ready to sort of change my mindset. I'm sick of sort of being miserable and unhappy in my body. Like, let's move a little bit more towards that, radical liberation phase. I do think this time of life, the confidence or the independence that can sometimes come with it can be a great catalyst sort of for change as well. So I do try to like hone in on that and focus on that. Like, hey, this is a dynamic moment. And like, what if we switched our thinking around all of these things we used to think were true? And like, isn't that fun? Isn't that interesting? I'm always like, how can we make this more fun? How can we make it more interesting? How can we make it more joyful, right? That's like the opposite of diet culture, which is so much like punishing and measuring and getting smaller. It's like, isn't that boring at this point? Haven't you been doing that for so long? What if we like did something new and interesting and fun instead of just this constant judgment and punishing? So that's another way I try to frame it, is like, let's get a little more free. Let's have a little bit more fun. We don't have to be stuck in this model that's just, boring.
Yeah, I think as you were saying that, I was thinking of, I remember having a conversation with my primary care, who's a naturopath also a couple of years ago. And I was feeling like I was coming into that perimeno rage. Like those were kind of some of my first symptoms into this stage of life.
Yeah.
And I'm talking to her, I'm like, I feel like I could blow up. Like my bullshit meter is so sensitive. And she just laughed. She's like, that's not such a bad thing. And so, I always think about that instance. And to your point too, when we can maybe even leverage that symptom that is coming up for women in this space of life and saying, well, isn't it weird that we're still being asked to chase this thin, young ideal, but yet you're seeing the bullshit in other things in life. Why not see it over here too? Right.
As well. Yeah. And yeah. Cause I think that is, some of the joys, like I think, folks tend to see perimenopause and that sort of menopausal transition in a potentially negative light, like the end of, the end of an era, and, the next potentially half of your life is like all downhill. But that's not sort of the way that I see it. It's not the way that I see people experiencing it. But latching on to almost that, like, you know, we see it as like a mirror of puberty, how like when you're a teenager, you're like, ugh, forget all this stuff. No, these grown-ups know nothing. I know everything. Like being so confident, so independent. Like, hey, let's, you know, attach onto that energetic shift and apply it across the board to be like, yeah, why am I spending so much of my, you know, precious time and energy on resources of like chasing some number on a scale? Like, is that really going to bring me joy? Like, what do I want my life to look like? And is, you know, prioritizing this one very narrow marker really the way I want to be spending my time right now?
Well, we talked about this a little bit at the beginning as we were talking about the weight gain piece, but I'm wondering if we can flesh that out a little bit more, and you can kind of give us a behind the scenes of what are some of the stages and changes of perimenopause, like that transition perimenopause into menopause, you know, from a physiological standpoint, in addition to the weight changes. What else could women be maybe expecting? Like you say, everybody's experience is different, but what are some maybe hallmark signs, symptoms, maybe how women could support themselves through that? Because I think that we don't talk about this enough, which is why I was so excited that you did a whole podcast addressed it to this, because we don't learn this stuff. We don't learn this stuff as young girls, young women, unless we've had that type of relationship with our mom, but so many of us didn't, because it was just one of those like, well, it just is what it is. Like, it's just life. I'm like, but we want to know, like, I want to understand my body a little bit more. So
like, tell us more.
Walk us through some of those stages.
Yes, and that's one of the main reasons I got sort of the inspiration to do my podcast is I would see, you know, women coming in late 30s, early 40s with a very classical sort of array of perimenopausal symptoms, but not have that on their radar at all. And oftentimes having seen, you know, a primary care doctor, a specialist, this person, that person, and everyone's, you know, throwing out all these theories. And I'm like, this is actually all pretty normal. Like, you are, based on your age, based on your symptoms, we can pretty much say you are a perimenopausal person. And all of the things that you're experiencing can be a normal part of that process. And I think first that's important because it lets us know this isn't a pathology necessarily. It takes some of the fear out of it. But second, it lets us know, hey, what are some of the tools sort of we can bring out? So the reason that I started the podcast, the reason why I'm sort of passionate about this in my practice as well, is people don't have that information. So one, they're getting no treatment, or they're getting mistreatment, or they're just like living in fear and bafflement about like what in the world is going on in my body. So one of the biggest things that I like people to be aware of is there's multiple phases to perimenopause. And the first very early stage can happen as, you know, early as 35 to 40-ish or so. So oftentimes people in their late 30s don't realize, oh, I could be experiencing symptoms of perimenopause. You can be having regular menstrual cycles, right? So still ovulating regularly, still having pretty typical bleeding patterns, and be in that early perimenopausal state. So that's kind of the first phase, is regular menstrual cycles, but starting to notice some hormonal shifts. Those hormonal shifts could come along weight and metabolism. They can come with mood. They can come sort of sleep changes. Then we move to sort of middle perimenopause, where we might start to see cycles getting closer together, heavier bleeding, lighter bleeding, spotting, that sort of menstrual regularity paired with some of those symptoms. Then we go to a later phase where cycles start to spread out. So we might be going 60 to 90 days in between menstrual cycles. At that phase, we're switching from a time of hormonal variability to a time that's more dominated by that lower estrogen state. And then finally, there's graduation days. Oh, hey, I haven't had a menstrual cycle in a year. I officially have experienced menopause. Now I am like a post-menopausal person. So anybody that's coming in with any sort of symptom picture, if they're 35 and above, I'm thinking, could this be explained by some of the hormonal shifts of perimenopause? Essentially lower progesterone and some variable estrogen levels. A lot of symptoms that are not related specifically to menstrual bleeding are symptoms that are the brain adjusting to estrogen levels. There's probably more brain adjustment to progesterone as well, but there's very little in the research on how progesterone impacts the brain. There's pitifully little research overall about like women's reproductive hormones related to brain changes, which hopefully is starting to shift. But in general, what we know the most about estrogen. And perimenopause is essentially, a lot of the symptoms are neurologic responses to varying hormone levels. So what we can see is mood changes, irritability, depression, brain fog, lower motivation. We can see sleep disturbances. Oftentimes waking up in the middle of the night is a big one. Later on, when we move to sort of more of that lower estrogen phase, we can see hot flashes as a big one, temperature changes, and vaginal dryness. That tends to be a little bit later on in the game. And then we can also see sort of shifts towards more insulin resistance for some folks. We can see shifts towards feeling like stress capacity. I think that's like a big one of folks feeling like, okay, usually I can juggle my 6 to 8 balls and keep them in the air all day long. All of a sudden that feels overwhelming to me. I'm more irritable, I'm more snappy, I don't want to do it anymore. And the way that I think about it is when your brain is trying to adapt to these varying hormone levels, that's a stressor in and of itself. So we've thrown a big stressor onto your plate, which might mean that for temporarily, that's the other big thing to remember, is this is a transition. This isn't the new normal. Perimenopause is a transition state. Postmenopause is the stable state. And a lot of times once people move through the transition to that stable state, they're pretty golden. Like there's not a lot of these sort of lingering symptoms, or if they are present, they're more easily managed. During the transition state, it's a time where we may have to double down on some of the health supporting tools that we have in our tool basket in order to not feel sort of symptomatic by this additional stressor of hormone change being added to the plate of a time of life, which for many people tend to be sort of already stressful. Might be peak career times, might be raising kiddos, might be taking care of aging parents, might be navigating changing relationships, right? A lot of folks are already pretty full going into this transition, and then you put that additional physiologic stressor of like, well, 1 month my estrogen's high, the next month it's really low, my progesterone overall is decreasing, and that neurologic capacity seems a little bit different. So that's another big component of it. That was a lot. That was like perimenopause hormones 101 condensed.
No,
so I got through a lot of information there.
No, that's perfect. But I want to ask one question, and this has a little bit of a self-serving personal question too. But first, I want to highlight, I'm really glad that your brain just goes to that place of perimenopause if someone is over the age of 35. I want to applaud you for that, because it is like tooth and nail sometimes to get providers to listen to someone in those early stages of perimenopause and what they're experiencing.
You're still having regular periods, so
or your early 40s, until you hit 45. Like we don't talk about it. So, but I'm curious what you've learned or see in the literature, again, kind of around that neurological space, is dizziness. Have you seen that as a symptom? Yeah. And what is that about? Because that is one thing that personally, like, I can't nail down. My care team can't nail down. Like we've done the iron test and we corrected that. And so talk to us a little bit about like that neurological. That's what my brain goes like. It feels like this is a neurological thing. So correct me if I'm wrong and enlighten us.
Because I've seen dizziness. The other weird one that I've seen is like numbness and tingling in like the fingers and toes, or what are called like paresthesias, which is like your body's interpreting sensations a little bit different. So like itchiness, even like pain. That's another one I didn't mention, but actually is like pretty huge. when we don't have as much estrogen, our ability to like perceive pain and inflammation changes a little bit. So folks can have like, people with chronic pain can have increased pain, but people with like old injuries can flare up, or all of a sudden they just feel like more pain than they did before. And that's also a big one. But I would put dizziness into that box of potentially less well-known neurologically mediated symptoms of perimenopause. Certainly you want to, do all the things, check iron levels, look out for orthostatic hypotension, make sure, electrolytes and blood sugar and protein and all those things are on board. But I would definitely put that into one of the potential neurologic manifestations, which means that doing some like out of the box thinking as far as treatment could potentially be helpful for folks. So either looking to, botanicals or even menopausal hormone therapy as a trial of treatment to see, oh, hey, does that make it better potentially? Obviously there's, individual risk benefit analyses that go into all that decision making. But I think when we open our mind to saying, oh, could perimenopause be an etiology? Then it opens up a whole nother sort of toolkit that we might not necessarily think of for dizziness, for pain, for like numbness and limb tingling, right? We're like, oh, hey, I had a patient who had been seeing multiple neurologists, rheumatologist, specialist. She was just convinced that there was something going on because she had this very intense numbness and tingling in her hands and feet, and it didn't respond to sort of B12. They did all the scans, nothing was wrong, and we actually decided to initiate with her gynecologist a trial of menopausal hormone therapy, like estrogen patch with progesterone, and that resolved the seemingly independently neurologic symptoms. So I think the benefit of having perimenopause on your radar of, oh, could this be a potential etiology, is it opens up a toolbox that maybe we wouldn't have thought of for something like dizziness, for something like pain.
Yeah, and glad you brought up the tingling and the pain too, because honestly, that and dizziness, they're fairly common symptoms to like a lot of different problems. I mean, you read any like warning pamphlet on any medication or supplement, and dizziness is always listed there, as could be pain and numbness and tingling.
So
yeah. And so it can be kind of a needle in the haystack to kind of pinpoint what's it coming from. But to your point, if someone's doing their biomarker checks and they're checking all of those kind of like common players of the electrolyte, the blood pressure, all of those things, blood sugar, and if all of that is checking out, then we need to dig around in that basket a little bit more and go, okay, well, what else is there? Yeah, this person still doesn't feel well.
Yeah, you start with what's more common. But again, if I have a woman, 35 and older, always in my analytical process, am I thinking, how could hormonal changes be playing a role in this? And how can we rule that in or out? And then how does that change sort of what kind of treatment trials we might do? And again, I think when healthcare practitioners don't have that on their radar, we might be jumping over some potential treatments that have a lower risk benefit ratio, and ending up, trying things. I feel like it's so common for just like first line of therapy for any woman who goes to a doctor's office that doesn't have like a clear explanation for a symptom. It's always, well, you must be depressed, you must be anxious. Let's, treat with a psychiatric medication, which for some folks is a great fit if that is truly what the issue is. Right. But I think our healthcare system tends to not pay attention to women's symptoms, to not trust their symptoms, and to like check them off to being purely related to like psychiatric and mental health, which again, sometimes can be such a great fit for folks and can be a helpful tool, but isn't sort of the be all and end all. And there's some other things we might start with or experiment with
Yeah.
first to make sure we're really doing that thorough workup.
Yes, I'm so glad you mentioned that. So many of my clients, and like you said, they have been through a lot of traumas. They are working with therapists, and so they do need that psychological help in some regards, but it ends up being this messy space because they're also in perimenopause in varying stages. All of my clients are usually anywhere from the early to mid to late stages and even on into the beginnings of menopause. And so from that psychological picture, it gets really tricky. And I think, I've got to have a lot of compassion and empathy for the psychologist and the psychiatrists and the people that are doing that med management too, because unless they're also familiar with these physiological changes that are changing, it may be hard for them to see the overlap that's happening, which might then affect the type of drug that the person is put on, or the dosing or something like that. Or can we do a little bit of pharmaceutical with lifestyle, with mindfulness, or like you said, bringing in all of those tools out of the basket. So along those lines, what are your top 3 recommendations for women in their 40s to support like energy, mood, sleep as they're kind of moving through these phases of perimenopause? What are your go-tos?
Yeah. I think the first one, and the one that's probably hardest to do, is the stress management piece. It is so crucial. It is so big. It is so complicated. But starting with understanding I'm in a phase of life in which my stress tolerance is going to be lower. Removing those things, there's always multiple components. Component 1, I think, is like removing those things from the plate that have the potentially to be sort of removed. It might not be the time to sort of be the room parent or do this big volunteer project, or, where can we kind of trim off some of the extra expectations? That's a first phase. The second phase is asking for the help that you need from your community, from family, if you happen to have local family, from friends, from partners. I think that we tend in our culture to be very individualistic. I can do it by myself. Let me do everything. Let me handle everything. So getting rid of sort of excess obligations, asking for help, and then bringing in whatever therapeutic tools we need to help with our stress responsivity, because there's always stressors that are inevitable. And to some degree, we can modify our response to those stressors through therapy, through mindfulness, through meditation. So I think the mindset piece is huge. The other component of that is movement. I'm such a big proponent of physical activity in whatever way is possible and enjoyable for that person. That's one of the other things that bums me out so much about sort of diet culture is we have paired movement to weight loss in a way that has either made people think, well, if I exercise and don't lose weight, I should quit exercising. If I'm at a weight and my body is, how I want it to be, then I don't need to exercise. It has made a lot of exercise spaces, gyms, classes, very weight, fat phobic, unwelcoming, not open to people of all ages and abilities. Like, to me, moving our human bodies is such an important part of stress management, of feeling joy, of being strong, of building muscle so we can age with less impact, like on our bones and mobility. To me, there is no healthy transition through perimenopause that does not include some form of movement on the spectrum of, again, what is working for that person's ability, what do they enjoy doing, but there's almost always a way to figure that piece out. So I think movement is super, super, super important. And again, I understand all of the barriers and limitations that people might feel there, but I think that is one of the worst side effects of diet culture is how it's ruined people's relationship to physically moving their bodies. So stress management, movement, I think, is a big component of it. The third thing I think is like building a healthcare team where people are listening to you. That's step one. People are listening to you. They're being respectful of your experiences. They're taking them seriously, and they're offering you like a menu of options. So that menu of options can include nutrition interventions. It can include botanical interventions. It can include doing thorough lab work, because while perimenopause can be a component of somebody's health story, age 35 and above, it's not the only one. We don't want to get so blindsided that we say, well, everything is perimenopause. We want to make sure we're looking at nutrient levels, thyroid, etc., and that it includes, that we have the right sort of team of support. So I would say we've got the stress management piece, we've got the movement piece, we've got the building your right healthcare team piece. So you're being offered the therapeutics that sort of match your need. And then another part of that goes back to the stress, I think, is like the fun and community piece. I think making sure that there's access to that oxytocin, that we're have the ability to, bond, to laugh, to have fun. I think that is something that a lot of folks maybe lose by this phase of life because of their responsibilities, because of maybe some of the cultural lessons we have about like what's appropriate behavior for a certain age group, what should we be prioritizing. And that fun can be woven into the stress management. The fun can be woven into the movement. The fun can be woven into the team of sort of people that are supporting your health. So they all wiggle together to some degree. They're not independent silos, but I would say that's like a very good, solid, foundational approach.
Yeah, I love that. And I appreciate you highlighting the fun part of it, how that can be woven in there. And of course, the movement piece. And we've had a number of folks on the podcast so far that have talked about movement and how do we kind of start changing that frame of mindset around movement. And we'll have more of that in season 3 as well, because I think it's just it's so important and so fundamental, because it's a way to also be connecting with your body. We spend so much time in our head and not in our body. And if that's another thing that could be highlighted during this time of life, is getting to know your body on a pretty intimate level, above and beyond hunger, fullness cues, as it is in my work. But so I see movement as that way to kind of be connecting with your body too, and getting to know her and listen to it, and all of those things.
Yeah, it's so important, I think. And again, you can move in community, you can move for joy, you can move with your friends, you can move in a way that makes you laugh. Like, you can stack all of these things up. So it's not like you're spending, from morning, noon, and night trying to meet all of these goals. You can figure out ways to weave them all together, to do multiple sort of things at once. So that's, what I try to work with people, is how can we sort of create this like nice, juicy, bouncy foundational support, so that the ups and downs of hormones and stressors, they kind of have a softer place to land, and we can kind of like bounce and move with them, versus just kind of feeling like there's this just like rigid, hard bottom that you're just falling and crashing into.
Gritting and bearing it.
Yeah, it's like, let's create some like juicy flexibility. That's what we're going for, ideally.
I love that. So
again, I think
I was going to say, where can people learn more about you and your work, and if they wanted to connect with you more?
Yeah. I have a website, drcaitlin.com. And then we have the podcast, The Change. You can find it on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, which might be the same as iTunes, maybe. There's also a direct link on my website. I am a social media minimalist. That's part of my movement towards joy and juicy flexibility. So I don't have, I do, I think, have a Facebook maybe from like 10 years ago for my business. I've got an Instagram that I post on an annual, once per year basis. But outside of that, people can join my newsletter through drcaitlin.com. They can listen to the podcast. I'm currently contemplating the joy work ratio of recording a second season. So we might have some more material there coming out in 2023, but that's sort of the best phase. My website is a good place. My website, newsletter, listen to the podcast. That's all a good ways to connect with me.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for sharing your information and wisdom with us today. And I learned a few things, and now I have a few more juicy questions to take back to my healthcare team. And I just appreciate your time and getting to meet you today. It's been great.
Awesome. Yeah, my pleasure. I always love diving into these conversations.